On Friday, January 13th, at the International Court of Justice, Israel presented their legal defense refuting the accusations of genocide made by South Africa. So in this video, I'm going to examine the arguments made by Galit Ragwan. She was the third speaker, and I think she gave the most compelling argument. Let's take a look.
In the time available, I will address three aspects of reality on the ground that the applicant has either ignored or misrepresented. First, Hamas's military tactics and strategy. Second, Israel's efforts to mitigate civilian harm during operational activity. And third, Israel's efforts to address humanitarian hardship in Gaza, despite Hamas's attempts at obstruction. Listening to the presentation by the applicant, it was as if Israel is operating in Gaza against no armed adversary, but the same Hamas that carried out the October 7 attacks in Israel is the governing authority in Gaza. And the same Hamas has built a military strategy founded on embedding its assets and operatives in and amongst the civilian population. Urban warfare will always result in tragic deaths, harm, and damage. But in Gaza, these undesired outcomes are exacerbated because they are the desired outcomes of Hamas. In urban warfare, civilian casualties may be the unintended but lawful result of attacks on lawfully military objectives. Booby-trapped homes detonate and kill indiscriminately. Mines in alleyways collapse structures around them. And over 2,000 rockets misfired by Hamas have landed inside Gaza, causing untold levels of harm. One telling example is a blast at the Al-Hali hospital on October 17. Hamas claimed that the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, attacked the hospital. Headlines around the world rushed to repeat this claim. The IDF later proved, and U.S. intelligence and other national security intelligence agencies independently confirmed, that the blast was the result of a failed launch from within Gaza. It was not, as Hamas claimed, the fault of the IDF.
All right, so in that last segment, she's referring to the Al-Ali hospital attack that took place on October 17th, where scores of civilians were killed. Hamas claims that it was an IDF missile that hit the hospital, and the IDF claims that it was a misfired rocket from Hamas. She's also claims that Israel has irrefutable evidence to support this. So let's take a look at some neutral observers and see what they think. Okay, so what we have here is an article published by the New York Times on October 24th and updated on October 31st, so about 1 to 2 weeks after the initial hospital attack. And this is the headline: a close look at some key evidence in the Gaza hospital blast. A widely cited missile video does not shed light on what happened, a Times analysis concludes. If we go further into the article, we see the Times findings does not answer what actually did cause the Al-Ali Arab hospital blast or who is responsible. The contention by Israeli and American intelligence agencies that a failed Palestinian rocket is to blame remains plausible. But the Times analysis does cast doubt on one of the most publicized pieces of evidence that Israeli officials have used to make their case, and complicates their straightforward narrative that they put forth. Further into the article, we see here the Al Jazeera footage was shared 3 times by IDF forces on X. In their tweet, they said, "Rocket aimed at Israel that misfired and exploded." Okay, the spokesman for the Israeli military also explicitly identified this munition as the misfired rocket that caused the explosion, and they did this in interviews with CNN and BBC. Numerous media outlets have shown the video footage, and several have cited it as evidence that a Palestinian rocket hit the hospital. But the Times concluded that the missile in the video was never near the hospital. It was launched from Israel, not Gaza, and appears to have exploded above the Israeli-Gaza border at least 2 miles away from the hospital. Okay, now here's an article on November 3rd, also by the New York Times, and it's titled "Revisiting the Gaza Hospital, We Look at the Evidence for Who is Responsible." So now New York Times did a follow-up article in November re-examining this hospital attack, and this is what they found. The Associated Press, CNN, and the Wall Street Journal each analyzed one set of footage and concluded that a malfunctioning rocket from Gaza, presumably from Palestinian fighters, caused the explosion. Israeli and U.S. intelligence officials have made the same argument. But an examination by the New York Times Visual Investigations team exposed flaws in the footage analysis. Times reporters used additional cameras to conclude that the projectile actually came from Israel and did not land near the hospital, which means it couldn't have caused the explosion. At least two independent analysts, as well as the Washington Post, agree, and CNN similarly has since published a new article withdrawing and updating its original finding. Now, here's an article published by Human Rights Watch on November 14th. It says, Gaza, unlawful Israeli hospital strikes worsen health crisis. Israel's blockade, bombardment, decimate healthcare system. Investigation as war crimes. So further in this report by Human Rights Watch, it says, the Israeli military's repeated, apparently unlawful attacks on medical facilities, personnel, and transport are further destroying the Gaza Strip's healthcare system and should be investigated as war crimes. Despite the Israeli military's claims on November 5th of Hamas's cynical use of hospitals, no evidence put forward would justify depriving hospitals and ambulances of their protected status under international humanitarian law. Now, to be fair, on November 26th, Human Rights Watch did another investigation, and they said, findings on October 17th Al-Ali hospital explosion. Evidence points to misfired rocket, but full investigation needed. Alright, so what does it all mean? Israel is claiming that they have irrefutable evidence that it was a misfired Palestinian rocket, but based on all these investigations, it seems to me that at best it's inconclusive. Let's continue on.
Damage to civilian structures is another fact claimed by South Africa as evidence of genocide. But South Africa does not consider the sheer extent to which Hamas uses ostensibly civilian structures for military purposes. Houses, schools, mosques, UN facilities, and shelters are all abused for military purposes by Hamas, including as rocket launching sites. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels dug by Hamas under populated areas in Gaza often cause structures above to collapse. In the slides before you, you can see a militant priming projectiles for launch on IDF forces in Gaza. You can see the holes in the residential house to hide and launch them.
Okay, so here we have a photo, actually two separate photos. One of looks like some kind of Palestinian fighter shooting through a residential home or some sort of building. I mean, there's not too much context here, so it's hard to tell. But yeah, I mean, this is urban combat, so of course they're going to be fighting in buildings. Is that an excuse to destroy 80% of the homes? I don't think so.
Here, you can see projectiles discovered underneath a bed in a child's bedroom.
All right, so, I mean, this is Propaganda 101. This is two separate photos, again. One photo that shows a sign that says baby girl, and another photo of some wooden crate that has some munitions on there. Why they couldn't have one photo that shows them both together so we know where each of these photos were taken, and maybe a description of the exact address and the date of when this photo and where this photo was taken. But let's continue on.
Here, a rocket being fired from a school. The launch site is circled in red. Here you can see firing from a UN school. You can see the letters UN on the roof, and the fire is circled in red.
Again, a photo with not much context. When was it taken? Where exactly was it taken? Maybe they did provide that evidence to the court, but it's not here. And again, this is a photo that shows some sort of fire that they circled, and I guess they're trying to say that that fire means that Hamas is firing rockets from there. That fire could be anything. That could be an Israeli missile that hit them. But I guess we'll just have to take their word for it.
And here, long-range rocket launchers hidden inside a Scouts Club building.
Again, Propaganda 101. This is two separate photos, which to me looks like different buildings. I mean, you can see the photos on top looks like some sort of school, and then the photo on the bottom looks like rocket launching sites. But if you look at them, they don't even look like they're in the same building. I mean, this one has beams. Maybe it's in the basement of the school. I don't know. They didn't say. But I would imagine if the IDF came across a school that had rocket launchers inside of it, that's huge evidence that Hamas is using human shields. Why wouldn't you just take a video from your cell phone or a camera, record the rocket launchers, and then turn around and show the classroom? Like, look, here's the classroom, here's the rocket launchers. Classroom, rocket launchers. No, instead we have two separate photos with no context, and they're not even. It doesn't even show that these rocket launchers are. And let's not lose sight of the fact that these photos she's given, these rudimentary propaganda 101 photos, she's using to justify this. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal showing the destruction to all the infrastructure that the IDF did. I mean, do those photos justify this? Hardly. Now, if we look at this report here, this is from that same Wall Street Journal article. By mid-December, Israel had dropped 29,000 bombs, munitions, and shells on the Strip. Nearly 70% of Gaza's 440,000 homes and about half of its buildings have been damaged or destroyed. The bombing has damaged churches, mosques, factories, apartment buildings, shopping malls, luxury hotels, theaters, and schools. Much of the water, electrical, communications, and healthcare infrastructure that made Gaza function is beyond repair. Okay, so this next segment is very important. She's about to go into the case of the Al Shifa Hospital. Now, the Al Shifa Hospital made headlines around the world because the IDF came in, raided the hospital, dismantled it, and forcibly evacuated all the patients. So she's going to give her justification for why they did that. Let's see.
What South Africa has neglected to bring before the court, however, is the overwhelming evidence of Hamas's military use of such hospitals. Hamas militants retreated to Rantisi Hospital in Gaza on October 7th with hostages from Israel, whom they then held in the basement. In the slide before you, you will see a militant going into Quds Hospital with an RPG.
Okay, so here, this looks like a fighter with an RPG. So I guess this photo right here justifies you dismantling the entire healthcare system. Let's continue on.
At Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest, Hamas managed operations from a closed-off area. Here you can see an opening to the tunnel that ran for hundreds of meters directly under the hospital. Here you can see the weapons found in different wings of the hospital.
Again, 4 separate photos that they created in some sort of elementary PowerPoint presentation. 4 separate photos. I don't see any hospital equipment nearby. It's just 4 isolated photos. Again, if you found all these items in the hospital, let's see. Let's see the hospital. Let's see them. Let's see it. You know, I need more evidence than this.
And here, CCTV footage showing armed militants bringing hostages into the hospital's lobby.
Okay, so finally, this is a good piece of evidence. I mean, to be fair, look, these is definitely some kind of militant fighters, what appears to be bringing a hostage into a hospital. Now, Hamas needs the hostages alive to use them as leverage. So if anything, Israel should be happy that there was probably an injured hostage that Hamas did not want to die, so they brought him to the hospital for care. Okay, so that was Israel's evidence and their justification for why they are dismantling the healthcare system, and in particular why they raided Al Shifa Hospital. Now let's go and look towards some, again, neutral investigations that were done regarding the Al Shifa Hospital. Let's take a look. Okay, so here we have the Washington Post. This is an article from the Washington Post on December 21st. The case of Al Shifa, investigating the assault on Gaza's largest hospital. Let's see what they concluded. The evidence presented by the Israeli government falls short of showing that Hamas had been using the hospital as a command and control center, according to the Washington Post analysis of open source visuals, satellite imagery, and all of the publicly released IDF materials. That raises critical questions, legal and humanitarian experts say. If I go down further, the Post analysis shows the rooms connected to the tunnel network discovered by IDF troops showed no immediate evidence of military use by Hamas. None of the 5 hospital buildings identified by Hagari appear to be connected to the tunnel network, and there is no evidence that the tunnels could be accessed from within the hospital wards. Okay, and furthermore, this article takes a quote from a senior U.S. member of Congress, and he says, quote, "Before, I was convinced that Al Shifa was where these operations were taking place. I think there has to be a new level of demonstration. They should have more proof at this point." End quote. That's from a U.S. member of Congress.
The director of the hospital has admitted that numerous members of hospital staff belong to Hamas's military wing.
شو اسمك الرباعي؟
أحمد محمد حسن الكحلوت.
وصف لي كيف الحماس استخدم في مستشفى تبعك لتخباية ناشدين عسكريين.
هم اللي خبوهم بشكل رسمي، لهم تنسيق اللي أنا بعرف حسب الموظف، هم القيادات السياسية واللي هم المسؤولين الكبر، مسؤولين عسكري ومدني. كان لهم غرف يتخبوا فيها، قعدوا فيها تقريبا 10 أيام، بعدين غيروا الأماكن لمكان تاني، وبعدين طلعوا برا المستشفى.
ليش بيتخبوا في المستشفى؟
عشان المستشفى أمان لهم.
Okay, so, I mean, to me, I don't know what you think, that looks like it could easily have been a forced confession. Now, why do I think that? Well, there's a reason why the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, any respectable news organization across the world, nobody has reported a story on this confession. If there was an actual confession that the hospital is being used by Hamas, I think that would be a big story. But none of these respectable news organizations did a story on it. Why? Because it's likely a forced confession. Let's continue on.
The list goes on. In every single hospital that the IDF has searched in Gaza, it has found evidence of Hamas military use. Israel is acutely aware that because of Hamas's use of hospitals as shields for its military operations, in grave violations of international humanitarian law, patients and staff are at risk. This is why the IDF has reached out to every hospital and offered assistance in relocating patients and staff to safer areas. Hospitals have not been bombed. Rather, the IDF sends soldiers to search and dismantle military infrastructure.
Okay, so very important point. Right there, she just said at the ICJ that hospitals have not been bombed. Let's take a look at what the actual reality is on the ground. The strikes analyzed by the Times, the New York Times, did not appear to be targeting underground infrastructure. Two of the most severe strikes hit upper floors of the maternity ward. This is video footage of it. By 8 a.m., the same wing of the maternity building had been struck again. This time, a section of the exterior wall was blown out and the interior of the building was considerably damaged. So guys, this is what it looks like to not bomb a hospital, apparently. Okay, now furthermore, this is a United Nations report on the hospital attacks in Gaza. And as we see right here, this was published on January 5th. Okay, nearly 600 attacks on healthcare in Gaza and West Bank since war began. Hospitals and other vital medical infrastructure in Gaza and the West Bank have been attacked nearly 600 times since war erupted in the enclave in response to the Hamas-led terror attack in southern Israel, the UN Health Agency said on Friday.
Yes, damage and harm have occurred as a result of hostilities in hospitals' vicinity, sometimes by IDF fire, sometimes by Hamas, but always as a direct result of Hamas's abhorrent method of warfare. Israel has published plenty of evidence of the extensive misuse by Hamas of medical facilities in direct violations of international humanitarian law. It has brought journalists to see firsthand.
So yes, in this situation, I agree. Israel did bring journalists in to see firsthand, and here's a report from the Washington Post that I showed earlier. This was their conclusion. The rooms connected to the tunnel network discovered by IDF troops showed no immediate evidence of military use by Hamas. None of the 5 buildings identified by Hagari appear to be connected to the tunnel network. There is no evidence that the tunnels could be accessed from inside hospital wards. So they invited journalists, and this is what the journalists found.
What the applicant neglected to inform the court, however, was that Hamas has, in its contempt for Palestinian civil life, regularly and deliberately fired from such zones, turning areas of relief into zones of conflict. Here before you, you can see one example of a launch site adjacent to the humanitarian zone, both amplified in larger pictures. And in the next slide, you can see evidence of a rocket launched from next to Gaza's water desalination facility.
So again, she's providing more photos without context, without dates, without exact locations. This photo of the water desalination facility shows a hole. I guess that's evidence that they're firing rockets from a water plant. Again, because she needs to justify why they have been attacking all the infrastructure, why they blew up all the water plants. Well, look, see that photo? There's rockets there. Okay, again, so in her reality, Hamas is firing rockets from UN shelters. Let's see what the actual reality on the ground is, as observed by neutral investigators. So right here, December 7th, New York Times. Israel says Hamas fired rockets from near Gaza shelters. The claim adds to the growing concern that there is no safe place in the enclave for those who have been displaced since the war began. The report goes on to say, the video released by Israel shows what appears to be a rocket launching position about 109 yards from the edge of a tent city. It is also about 270 yards from the largest logistics base in Gaza used by United Nations. The video does not show rockets being fired, but displays the launch site before and after the reported launches. The New York Times could not verify the claim that rockets had been fired from the site. So I found a video that the New York Times and the IDF are referring to. Here it is. December 6th, rocket launch site. You see there's a video of the rocket launch. Okay. Now you'll see as it pulls out. Okay, I'll pause it right there. Okay, look at this. Here's the rocket launch site. Here's the UN facility. And so the rocket launch site is at least 3 football fields away and on top of a hill. So instead of shooting a precision rocket to take out that site, you're dropping a 2,000-pound bomb on the UN shelter. Let's continue.
I now would like to address briefly the second issue, Israel's efforts at mitigation of civilian harm. Here, too, the applicant tells not just a partial story, but a false one. For example, the application presents Israel's call to civilians to evacuate areas of intensive hostilities, quote, as an act calculated to bring about its physical destruction, quote. This is a particularly egregious allegation that is completely disconnected from the governing legal framework of international humanitarian law.
Okay, again, so Israel is presenting their set of reality that what they were doing, the evacuation orders were humane, and then here is the neutral investigators' interpretation of what the actual reality on the ground is. Okay, so as we can see here, this is an article from Reuters on October 13th. Israeli military orders Gazans to leave northern half of territory. On Friday, the Israeli military ordered over 1 million civilians living in the northern half of Gaza to evacuate within 24 hours. Okay, so here's a quote from that same Reuters article. The UN spokesperson said Israel's call for Gaza civilians to leave was impossible to carry out, quote, without devastating humanitarian consequences, end quote. Here's a headline from PBS NewsHour. Israel orders evacuation of 1 million in northern Gaza in 24 hours. And in the PBS article, it says as follows. The UN warned that so many people fleeing en masse with just a 24-hour deadline would be calamitous. Hamas, which staged a shocking and brutal attack on Israel nearly a week ago and has fired thousands of rockets since, dismissed it as a ploy and called on people to stay in their homes. Okay, so what do we have? Again, we have Israel presenting their reality, which says that their evacuation orders were humane and they were done so to protect civilians. And then we have the actual reality on the ground, where the UN says that these orders to evacuate 1 million people in 24 hours is completely inhumane and could be calamitous. Let's continue.
Nevertheless, in coordination with the UN, Israel enables fuel to enter Gaza to service essential infrastructure, such as sewage treatment, desalination plants, water pumps and hospitals, and cellular infrastructure for maintaining communication. Here, a picture of incubators that the IDF provided to Shifa Hospital. Here, a picture of an ambulance convoy coordinated by COGAT. A picture of consignments. A picture of ambulances, the entry of which was coordinated by COGAT. And finally, more consignments waiting to enter Gaza.
So, okay, let's continue on. So again, here's a report from January 1st of this year from the New York Times. Half of Gazans are at risk of starving, UN warns. More than 90% of Palestinians in the territory say they have regularly gone without food for a whole day, according to the United Nations. Right here is a report from the United Nations and the World Health Organization talking about the starvation that's happening in Gaza. They say over 90% of the population in the Gaza Strip was classified as IPC or above, crisis or above. And we see this graphic here, 34% of Gazans are in crisis, 42% are in emergency, and 17% are in catastrophe. So this paints a much different picture than what she says is going on. Now, if you don't think that those reports are credible, well, take it from 2 American senators. Right here, 2 U.S. senators, Chris Van Hollen and Jeff Merkley, both members of the Senate Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committee, released the following statement after their visit to Egypt and Jordan. And this was written on January 10th, so just written about a week ago. Quote, "The humanitarian disaster in Gaza is worsening by the day. Innocent Palestinians are on the verge of starvation. Injured children are having their limbs amputated without anesthesia. Sewage is spilling onto the streets, and health officials are warning of the imminent outbreak of cholera and other diseases." Okay, so in conclusion, the reality that Israel presents is a fantasy and completely contradicts the actual reality on the ground. And the excuses that Israel gives for the obliteration of over 70% of residential homes, their systematic destruction of the healthcare system and infrastructure, and the inhuman humanitarian catastrophe is in no way, shape, or form justified, and it must end. Stay tuned for more videos.